Everyone tells you synchronicities are meaningful coincidences. A song playing at exactly the right moment, a stranger saying the one sentence you needed to hear, a name you thought about 10 minutes before it walked into the room. Jung would have told you something far less comforting. He didn't think synchronicity was proof the universe was arranging itself around you. He thought it was proof that the wall between your inner world and the outer one is thinner than you've been told, and that most people go their entire lives without noticing the places where it tears. You already know the feeling. You've had it more than once, and you've probably done what most people do with it. Mentioned it once, laughed it off, filed it under strange and moved on. That instinct to minimize it isn't stupidity, it's self-protection. Because if you actually stop to take it seriously, you'd have to ask a much harder question than, was that a coincidence? And most people would rather not. Carl Jung asked that question for most of his professional life, and it nearly cost him his reputation. He was a psychiatrist, not a mystic, working in an era when psychology was fighting to be taken seriously as a science. And yet, he kept running into patients whose inner lives and outer circumstances lined up in ways that causality couldn't account for. A dream the night before a death, a scarab beetle tapping against a window at the exact moment a patient described one in a dream. He didn't reach for mysticism to explain it. He reached for a new category entirely, one science didn't have a name for yet. He called it synchronicity, an acausal connecting principle, two events joined not by cause and effect, but by shared meaning. Today, we're going to walk through what synchronicity actually is according to Jung, why it shows up more at certain points in a life than others, and what it demands of you once you stop being able to ignore it. This isn't a video about signs from the universe. It's about what happens in a person's psyche right before the universe starts to look like it's paying attention. There's a thread running through this whole idea, and it isn't decorative. Jung's own image for the psyche wasn't a hierarchy or a machine. It was closer to a web, with the conscious mind sitting at one small point of contact and everything else extending outward, connected by lines too fine to see under ordinary conditions. Synchronicity, in his framework, is what happens when you catch a glimpse of one of those lines. Not because it was hidden from you on purpose, because you weren't built to see it under normal stress, normal distraction, normal life. Most people who dismiss synchronicity aren't dismissing it because they've never experienced it. They're dismissing it because the culture that raised them offered exactly two acceptable categories for a strange coincidence, and neither one leaves room for taking it seriously without embarrassment. Either it's meaningless, statistically inevitable in a world full of people and events, the kind of thing that happens often enough that noticing a handful of instances tells you nothing. Or it's evidence of something the speaker would rather not be associated with in a room full of people they respect. Superstition, New Age thinking, a mind that stopped being rigorous. Most people choose the first category not because they've reasoned their way to it, but because the second one costs too much socially. Jung's actual position doesn't fit neatly into either box, which is part of why it took the psychological establishment decades to know what to do with it, and part of why most people still haven't heard an honest account of what he actually meant. Here's what most explanations get wrong from the start. They treat synchronicity like a gift, something that happens to lucky, spiritual, or specially attuned people. Jung's patients weren't chosen. They were often in crisis. The scarab beetle patient wasn't enjoying a peaceful, expansive moment of connection with the cosmos. She was so rigidly rational, so defended against her own inner life, that Jung had spent months unable to reach her through ordinary analysis. The beetle showed up at the exact moment her defenses had nowhere left to go. Synchronicity, more often than romance would have you believe, arrives at the exact point where a person's usual way of coping has run out of road.
That's worth sitting with.
because it reframes the entire conversation people have about this topic. If synchronicity mostly appears at breaking points, transitions, grief, decision paralysis, the edges of identity, then noticing it isn't a spiritual achievement. It's a symptom, not of something wrong with you, but of something already underway, whether you consented to it or not. Think about someone who spent years making every decision by spreadsheet, pros and columns, weighing risk, running the numbers on every choice until the choice made itself. It worked, mostly, until the year everything that mattered stopped fitting into columns. A parent's diagnosis, a marriage quietly ending, a job that no longer meant what it used to. That was the year the coincidences started. A book falling open to the exact page, a conversation overheard on a train that answered a question they hadn't said out loud to anyone. It wasn't mysticism finding them, it was that the part of them capable of noticing pattern had finally been given room to work, because the spreadsheet had stopped being able to hold everything that was happening. This is where Jung's framework becomes crucial, because he wasn't just describing an experience, he was describing a mechanism. Jung believed the psyche has two ways of processing reality that are usually kept apart by force of habit. The rational, causal, linear mode most people live in almost exclusively, and a symbolic, associative, meaning-based mode that gets crowded out the moment life feels manageable. He called the process that bridges the two the transcendent function, not because it's supernatural, but because it transcends the usual split between conscious control and unconscious material, producing something neither side could have generated alone. Synchronicity, in this light, is the transcendent function showing its work. It's what it looks like from the outside when the unconscious has something urgent enough to say that it stops waiting for a dream and starts using the actual world as material. The scarab wasn't a message from beyond. It was the unconscious using the only channel left because every conventional one had already been tried. It helps to understand why Jung reached for such an unusual category in the first place, rather than simply calling this coincidence and leaving it there. He was trained rigorously in the causal thinking of his era. Cause produces effect. Effect can be traced back to cause, and anything that can't be traced this way gets treated as unexplained or unreal. But the work with his patients kept handing him data that framework couldn't hold. A patient dreams of a specific, unlikely accident the night before it happens to a family member states away, with no possible channel of communication between them. A man mentions offhand a business associate he hasn't thought of in years, and the associate calls him within the hour, for the first time in over a decade. Jung didn't collect these stories because he found them charming. He collected them because his job required him to account for his patients' inner lives accurately, and pure causality kept failing to explain a meaningful fraction of what he was seeing. What made him unusual among his peers wasn't that he noticed the pattern. Plenty of clinicians before and after him noticed strange coincidences and simply filed them away as anecdotes, unworthy of theory. What made him unusual was that he refused to let the discomfort of not having an explanation push him toward either extreme. He didn't announce that the universe runs on magic. He also didn't dismiss the pattern to protect his professional standing, which would have been the safer path for a man already fighting to be taken seriously after his very public and painful split from Freud. He held the tension of an unexplained pattern for decades, refining the idea slowly, testing it against case after case, because he thought his patient's actual experience mattered more than his own comfort with ambiguity. You can feel this pattern happening before you can name it. There's a particular quality to the moments right before a strong synchronicity, a kind of pressure, a sense that something in your life has become too tight to keep carrying the way you've been carrying it. People rarely describe the coincidence itself as the strange part. They describe the days before it, the unease that had no object, the sense of being on the verge of something without evidence to justify it. A woman sits in a waiting room 3 weeks after leaving a relationship she still can't fully explain even to herself. She isn't thinking about the relationship in that moment. She's thinking about nothing in particular, flipping through a magazine she wouldn't normally read. She lands on an article about a woman who left an entirely different kind of life, for entirely different reasons. And one sentence in that article names the exact feeling she hasn't had words for in 3 weeks. She doesn't cry in the waiting room. She just sits very still, because something has clicked into place that no amount of thinking had been able to reach. That's the pattern Jung kept encountering. Not answers arriving from outside a person, but a person's own unspoken material finding its way back to them through the world, because the direct route inward had been blocked. Most explanations for this experience fail because they only offer 2 options. Either it's meaningless chance, or it's a message from some external benevolent force arranging your life for you. Jung refused both. He wasn't willing to dismiss the pattern the way strict rationalism demanded, but he also wasn't willing to hand the meaning-making over to fate or providence. He located the meaning inside the person, in the relationship between what they were carrying unconsciously and what showed up to meet it. The magazine article didn't know she existed. Her psyche did. This is the part that tends to unsettle people once they actually understand it, because it removes the comfort of both extremes. If it isn't random, you can't dismiss it. If it isn't sent from outside, you can't simply receive it and wait for the next one. You have to ask what in you it's responding to. And that question tends to lead somewhere a person has usually been avoiding. Here's a pattern worth noticing in your own life before we go further. Synchronicities tend to cluster around whatever you've been refusing to look at directly. Not what you're actively thinking about, what you've been managing not to think about. The topic you change the subject on, the decision you keep almost making, the person whose name you avoid saying out loud. Jung's patients, again and again, found their unconscious material surfacing in the world precisely in the areas where their conscious mind had built the strongest defenses. Someone who has spent a decade telling themselves a parent's approval doesn't matter to them anymore will be the one who keeps encountering that parent's exact words, verbatim, in unrelated conversations, on the radio, in a stranger's offhand comment at a checkout line. Someone avoiding the question of whether they actually want children will be the one who can't walk 2 blocks without a pram crossing their path, a friend's pregnancy announcement landing in their inbox, a memory surfacing from nowhere. It isn't a curse. It's closer to a compass whose needle only moves near what's actually true. Here's something usually left out of the scarab story when it gets retold, and it changes how the whole account should be understood. The beetle didn't fix anything. Jung was careful in his own writing about the case not to claim the coincidence alone dissolved his patient's rigid defenses in a single dramatic instant, the way the story tends to be compressed when it's repeated secondhand. What actually happened was slower and less cinematic. The coincidence cracked something open. It broke, for a moment, her absolute certainty that reality only worked one way. And that crack gave Jung an opening to do the much longer, much less remarkable work of ordinary analysis that followed. The beetle wasn't the cure. It was the door. She still had to walk through it, over months, through the same kind of unglamorous, repetitive psychological work anyone does when they're actually changing rather than just being amazed by something for an afternoon. This matters because it's exactly the part most retellings of Jung's most famous case leave out, and leaving it out distorts what synchronicity is actually for. It isn't the moment of transformation. It's the moment that makes transformation possible, by breaking a certainty that was standing in the way. What comes after the coincidence is where the real work happens, and it looks nothing like magic. It looks like ordinary, patient, often tedious effort, sustained over a period of time long enough to actually change something. What disturbed Jung about this pattern wasn't the phenomenon itself. It was how consistently his patients resisted acknowledging what the pattern was pointing to, even while marveling at the coincidence. They'd tell him about the beetle, the number, the name, the stranger's sentence, and then change the subject the moment he asked what it might mean about their own life. Wonder, it turns out, is often easier to sit with than insight. A strange coincidence can be admired at a safe distance. What it's revealing usually cannot. This is where most people get stuck, and where most videos on this topic stop short of saying anything useful. They tell you synchronicity is real, that Jung took it seriously, that the universe seems to be paying attention, and they leave you there, mildly enchanted, with nothing to actually do about it. But Jung didn't study this phenomenon to produce enchantment. He studied it because his patients kept getting stuck at the exact point where the pattern demanded something of them, and most of them stopped there. We're about to get into what it actually costs to go further than that point, what it means to stop collecting synchronicities like curiosities and start letting them mean something about the direction your life is actually asking you to go. Before we do, there's something worth naming honestly about why most people stop at wonder instead. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes with a life that keeps arranging itself around you, and a job that's slowly becoming your entire identity. You notice the pattern, the timing, the names, the numbers, and some part of you wants to follow it somewhere. But following it means admitting the current arrangement of your life isn't accidental either. It means admitting you've built a version of yourself that avoids the very thing your unconscious keeps pointing toward with increasing insistence. That's a heavier thing to carry than a strange coincidence. It's a verdict on how you've been living. If any part of this is landing because you felt that exact tightness, the sense that your own life keeps handing you the same message in different disguises, and you keep declining to open it, that's worth sitting with for a second before we go further, because the rest of what Jung found only makes sense once you've admitted that much to yourself. There's a guide built for exactly that moment, the one where you've noticed the thread but haven't pulled it yet. It's called True Self-Discovery, and it isn't a book about interpreting coincidences. It's 24 practical reflection exercises built on Jung's own methods, designed for the specific work of finding your way back to what you've been avoiding, one honest question at a time. If the pattern we've been describing feels less like a video topic and more like your actual week, it's worth having something in hand for what comes after the recognition. It's linked below if you want it. Because what we're about to get into next, the part where the pattern stops being interesting and starts being demanding, is exactly where most people need a way back to themselves, not just another explanation of what's happening to them. The thread doesn't stay a curiosity for long once you start actually pulling it. That's the next layer, and it's the one Jung spent the rest of his career trying to describe honestly, without either inflating it into mysticism or shrinking it into coincidence theory. Jung noticed that the frequency and intensity of synchronicities in a person's life almost always tracked with proximity to what he called individuation, the long, uneven process of becoming a fuller, more integrated version of yourself, rather than the fragmented, performance-driven version most people settle into by adulthood. The pattern didn't arrive randomly across a life. It clustered at thresholds. Before a major decision, in the middle of grief, during the collapse of an identity that had stopped fitting, right before something in a person had to change whether they were ready or not. This is the deeper mechanism worth understanding, because it explains something that pure coincidence theory can never explain. Why the same person can go years without a single meaningful synchronicity, and then experience 3 or 4 in a single month during a period of upheaval. It isn't that the universe suddenly started paying more attention. It's that the person's unconscious material had finally accumulated enough pressure to start finding its way out through every available channel. Dreams, slips of the tongue, physical symptoms, and yes, the external world itself, in the form of coincidence that carries unmistakable personal meaning. It's worth being precise about what pressure means here, because it isn't a metaphor Jung used loosely. He observed that unconscious material behaves, in a rough but useful sense, the way any suppressed system behaves. The longer something is denied direct expression, the more forcefully it tends to surface once a channel opens, and the more channels it tends to use simultaneously once it does. A grief unacknowledged for a decade doesn't quietly disappear during those 10 years. It accumulates. And when a life event finally cracks the container that's been holding it, a death, an anniversary, an unrelated loss that echoes the original one, the grief doesn't emerge through a single, tidy channel. It shows up in dreams, in sudden tearfulness at unrelated moments, in physical tension that has no medical explanation, and yes, often, in a run of coincidences clustered around the anniversary or the echo, as though the psyche is using every available surface to make the same point at once. This is why the timing of synchronicity clusters tends to be so recognizable in hindsight, even though it rarely feels predictable in advance. People can usually name, looking backward, exactly what threshold they were approaching during the weeks a pattern intensified. A birthday that mattered more than they expected, the anniversary of a loss, the season a marriage quietly started ending, the year a parent's health forced a reckoning with mortality that had been easy to postpone. The coincidences weren't caused by the threshold in any mechanical sense. They were correlated with it, in Jung's specific and carefully limited use of that word, connected by shared meaning rather than shared cause, arriving together because the same unconscious material was pressing against the same threshold from multiple directions at once. There's a particular kind of moment worth picturing precisely because it shows up in almost every account of this pattern once someone is willing to describe it honestly rather than just the punchline. A man is sorting through his late father's belongings, a task he's been putting off for the better part of a year, telling himself he simply hasn't had time. He finally opens a box of old letters he has no memory of his father keeping, and the first one he pulls out, at random, from a stack of dozens, is dated the exact day of his own birth. Not addressed to him, not about him at all, just a letter from an old friend discussing something unrelated, dated by pure chance to a day that means everything to him, and meant nothing in particular to whoever wrote it. He sits on the floor of his father's study for a long time. Nothing about the letter's content is significant. Its date is the only thing that matters, and its date is the only thing that could not have been arranged by anyone. Picture someone in the exact middle of leaving a career they built an entire identity around. They haven't told anyone yet. They're still showing up, still performing competence, still answering to a title that no longer means anything to them privately. In the space of 2 weeks, they run into their old university mentor at an airport they never fly through, receive an email from someone with the same first name as the mentor about an unrelated matter, and overhear a stranger use the mentor's exact phrase, the one that originally set them on the career path they're now trying to leave, word for word, in a conversation that has nothing to do with them. 3 unrelated events, one unmistakable thread. Not because the universe was staging an intervention, because the part of them contemplating the exit had grown loud enough to start showing up everywhere they looked. Jung's insight here goes further than most retellings allow. He wasn't just claiming that unconscious material surfaces symbolically. Every decent psychologist before and after him agreed with that much. His genuinely radical claim was that under the right conditions, that unconscious material doesn't just surface in dreams and slips. It correlates with events in the external world that have no causal link to the person's mind at all. The stranger at the airport had no idea who they were speaking to. and yet the meaning landed exactly where it needed to. This is the part where the transcendent function stops being an abstract concept and becomes something closer to a description of how transformation actually happens in a person. The transcendent function isn't the unconscious overpowering the conscious mind, and it isn't the conscious mind suppressing the unconscious back into silence. It's the third thing that emerges when neither side is allowed to win. A new symbol, a new understanding, a new capacity that didn't exist in either the rational plan or the buried feeling alone. Synchronicity, Jung argued, is one of the clearest external signatures of that third thing actually forming. That's a very different claim than the universe sent you a sign. It means the coincidence isn't a message being delivered to you from somewhere else. It's evidence that something inside you has reached the threshold of integration, that the split between what you've been consciously living and what you've been unconsciously carrying has narrowed enough that reality itself starts to reflect the convergence. Here's where the pattern deepens again, because there's a common misunderstanding worth clearing up directly. People tend to assume synchronicity means the universe agrees with whatever direction they're already leaning, a kind of cosmic permission slip. That's not how it actually works, and Jung's case histories make that clear. Synchronicities showed up just as often around a resistance a patient needed to face as around a choice they needed to make. The scarab patient wasn't shown a beetle because Jung's approach was correct and she should agree with it. She was shown a beetle because her rigid, purely rational stance had become the exact obstacle standing between her and her own inner life. And the psyche, having exhausted the gentler roots, had to make its point in a way rationality itself couldn't dismiss. So the question a synchronicity is actually asking isn't, "What should I do?" It's closer to, "What have you been refusing to let yourself know?" That distinction matters because it moves the locus of meaning away from prediction and back toward honesty. A synchronicity isn't a forecast. It's a mirror held up at exactly the angle you've been avoiding. Someone who keeps encountering the number that marked their father's death date isn't being told to make contact or to give up or to grieve on a schedule. They're being shown again and again that the grief hasn't finished its work, that some part of the relationship remains unintegrated, still asking to be metabolized rather than managed. What they do with that is genuinely theirs to determine. The pattern doesn't hand out instructions, it hands out pressure, aimed with uncomfortable precision. This is also where the shadow enters the picture, because Jung's shadow work and his theory of synchronicity were never separate projects. They were the same project examined from two angles. The shadow is everything about yourself you've decided is unacceptable and pushed out of conscious awareness. And the shadow, denied a direct route back into consciousness, doesn't simply disappear. It finds other channels. Projection is one. Physical symptoms are another. And synchronicity, in Jung's later work, becomes one of the more startling ones. The shadow using the actual texture of a person's external life to announce what it's been carrying. This pattern isn't limited to solitary reflection. It shows up just as often between two people who are close enough to be entangled in each other's unconscious material, whether or not either of them would describe it that way. Jung noticed this repeatedly in his work with couples and in his correspondence about family dynamics, that two people in a long, significant relationship often begin to synchronize in ways neither can fully account for. One partner dreams of an event the night before the other receives news of it. One partner starts humming a song the other was silently thinking about. This isn't romantic destiny at work, in Jung's account of it. It's closer to evidence that sustained emotional intimacy creates a kind of shared unconscious field, where material belonging to one person can surface through the other, because the usual boundary between two separate psyches has been worn thin by years of genuine closeness. This has a less comfortable implication worth naming. It means the strange coincidences that show up most often between two people aren't always evidence that the relationship is healthy. Sometimes they're evidence of exactly the opposite, that something unspoken between two people has grown large enough to need a channel neither person has been willing to open directly. A couple who can't discuss the resentment quietly building between them for years might find themselves having the identical dream on the same night. Both dreaming of the same argument neither has had the courage to start while awake. The synchronicity isn't announcing that the relationship is fated or blessed. It's often doing the opposite, announcing that something has gone unsaid for long enough that it's started finding its way out through whatever crack is available, including, apparently, two people's dreams on the same night. A man who prides himself on being endlessly patient, endlessly reasonable, the one who never raises his voice, keeps having the same experience. Strangers lose their temper at him for no clear reason, again and again, in situations that shouldn't provoke it. He tells the story as proof of other people's instability. What he doesn't see, what takes years to see, is that his own suppressed anger, never expressed, never even acknowledged, has to go somewhere. And it keeps finding its way into rooms he walks into, mirrored back at him by people who have no idea they're carrying it for him. That isn't superstition. It's projection given a stranger's face, appearing with a frequency too consistent to dismiss as bad luck. It's worth pausing on how strange this actually is when you take it seriously rather than skim past it. These strangers aren't performing on his behalf. They have their own reasons for their own outbursts, entirely unrelated to him, arising from their own lives, their own stress, their own unresolved material. And yet, the pattern persists, room after room, year after year, in a way ordinary probability struggles to fully account for. Jung's explanation doesn't require any of these strangers to be secretly connected to him. It only requires that his own suppressed material creates a kind of readiness in him, a subtle way of positioning himself, provoking without meaning to, walking into situations at exactly the angle most likely to draw out exactly this response, that operates entirely outside his conscious awareness. The synchronicity in this account isn't purely external. It's a collaboration between what he's carrying and what the world happens to offer, meeting at a frequency too precise to be coincidence, and too indirect to be anything as simple as cause and effect. There's a second, quieter version of this pattern worth naming, because it doesn't always announce itself through other people's faces the way projection does. Sometimes, the shadow surfaces through repetition instead, the same number appearing at pivotal moments, the same phrase arriving from unrelated sources within days of each other, the same object showing up in places it has no reason to be. A woman who has spent years telling herself she's over a broken engagement keeps encountering the date of the canceled wedding, on receipts, in phone numbers, in the time displayed on a clock the exact moment she glances at it, again and again, for months. She doesn't believe in signs. She's told everyone, including herself, that she's told this story enough times to be finished with it. But the date keeps finding her, with a frequency that pure probability makes difficult to explain away, because the part of her that hasn't finished grieving doesn't know how to file a formal request for attention. It uses whatever's available. Numbers are available everywhere, all day, which may be part of why they show up in this role so often. What Jung was ultimately circling, across decades of case notes and correspondence, was the idea that the boundary most people assume exists between inside me and out there in the world is far less solid than it feels. Reality doesn't bend to individual will. Jung was careful never to claim that, and careful to distance himself from readers who wanted to turn his work into a theory of manifestation. But meaning itself doesn't respect the inside-outside boundary the way causality does. Causality only cares about mechanism. This happened, therefore that happened. Meaning cares about resonance. This matters to you, and something in the world just rhymed with it in a way pure chance statistically shouldn't produce as often as it does. This is also where it becomes important to say plainly that Jung never claimed every unconscious conflict produces a synchronicity, and he never claimed the reverse either, that every synchronicity points to unfinished grief or suppressed anger specifically. Those were simply the categories his casework returned to most often, because those were the categories his patients were most practiced at avoiding. The actual content varies by person. What doesn't vary is the underlying shape, something pushed out of conscious awareness, still charged, still demanding integration, using whatever channel remains open once the direct ones have been closed off for long enough. This is roughly the halfway point of what there is to understand, and it's worth being honest about what comes next, because it's the part most explanations of synchronicity skip entirely. Understanding the mechanism is the easy half. What happens once you can no longer pretend you don't notice the pattern in your own life is the hard half. And it asks something of a person that wonder alone never does. The moment synchronicity stops being an interesting story and starts being undeniable in your own life is rarely a comfortable one. It tends to arrive with a specific, quiet dread rather than delight, because once you can no longer dismiss the pattern as coincidence, you also lose the ability to keep ignoring what it's been pointing toward. That's the breaking point Jung's own patients kept arriving at, and it's worth describing honestly because most content on this topic skips straight past it toward reassurance. There's a particular kind of person who has spent their entire adult life being the reliable one, reasonable, composed, the one who doesn't believe in signs, doesn't need meaning handed to them, prefers evidence to intuition. And then something happens that their framework can't absorb. Not once. Repeatedly over weeks, in a way that starts to feel less like an anomaly and more like a pattern too consistent to explain away. The first time, they laugh. The third time, they stop laughing. The fifth time, they lie awake doing something they would have called ridiculous a month earlier. Counting. Tracking. Wondering if they're losing their grip on the rational self they've spent decades building. That fear is real, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than talked out of. What breaks in a person at this threshold isn't their sanity. It's their certainty that the story they've been telling about who they are and how the world works was complete. That's a genuine death, in the sense Jung meant it, not a literal ending, but the collapse of a self-concept that can no longer account for what's actually happening. The composed, purely rational identity has to give something up. It has to admit there's a category of experience it has no tools for, and that admission costs something real. This is the part of the process Jung took more seriously than almost any of his contemporaries, because he'd lived through a version of it himself. In the years surrounding his break from Freud, Jung went through a period he later called his confrontation with the unconscious. A stretch of years marked by vivid, disturbing visions, a profound sense of psychological instability, and an isolation from the professional world that had previously validated him. He wasn't performing detachment from that experience when he later theorized about synchronicity. He'd already lived the collapse the theory describes. What emerged on the other side wasn't a return to his old rational self. It was something that could hold both, the capacity for rigor and the capacity for meaning, without needing either to cancel the other out. That's the actual shape of what synchronicity demands once you stop being able to dismiss it. Not a conversion to mysticism, and not a retreat back into pure rationalism, but the harder, less glamorous work of building a self large enough to hold contradiction without collapsing. It's worth being specific about what that period actually looked like for Jung, because the popular retelling tends to smooth it into something more dignified than it was. He described, in his own later writing, waking hours spent in near-continuous dialogue with figures that emerged from his own psyche, as though they had independent will, voices he didn't consciously generate, images he couldn't have manufactured on purpose. Colleagues worried about him. He worried about himself. There were stretches where he genuinely questioned whether he was witnessing the emergence of a deeper psychological truth or the onset of something closer to psychosis, and he had no external authority he could ask to settle the question for him, because no one else was there to verify what he was experiencing. He kept a private record of it for years before he trusted himself enough to let any of it inform his professional theories. That's not the biography of someone casually intrigued by the unconscious. It's the biography of someone who nearly lost his footing entirely in order to understand what he was eventually going to be able to offer his patients. Most people's version of this threshold is quieter than Jung's, but structurally identical. It rarely looks like visions. It looks like a period, sometimes weeks, sometimes years, where the story a person has been telling about themselves simply stops accounting for the evidence. The competent one stops feeling competent. The person who never needed anyone starts needing someone and doesn't know how to ask. The parent who insisted their childhood was fine starts having dreams that suggest otherwise, night after night, until the daytime insistence becomes exhausting to maintain. Nobody announces this collapse publicly. Most people going through it keep showing up to the version of themselves everyone else still expects, while privately negotiating with a self-concept that no longer holds. Here's what that actually looks like in an ordinary life, because it rarely looks like the dramatic spiritual awakening people expect. It looks like a woman finally admitting, after the third unmistakable coincidence in a month, that the job she's been defending to everyone, including herself, has been quietly destroying something in her for 2 years, and that some part of her has known that the entire time. It looks like a man finally acknowledging that the anger showing up everywhere he turns is his own, unexpressed for so long it had to start borrowing other people's faces to be heard. It looks like sitting with a pattern instead of explaining it away, and asking the much less comfortable question, what has this been trying to tell me, and why have I been so determined not to hear it? This is where the cost becomes concrete, because integration is not a euphoric process. Jung was explicit about this in ways his more popularized interpreters often aren't. Individuation involves real loss, of a self-image that was flattering, of relationships that depended on you staying exactly as you were, of the specific kind of safety that comes from never looking too closely at your own contradictions. The man who admits his suppressed anger has been leaking out through strangers has to reckon with decades of quiet self-deception about how peaceful he actually is. The woman who admits her career has been slowly hollowing her out has to face the years already spent, the version of herself already built around a lie she can no longer sustain. This is the death Jung's alchemical language points toward without needing to be mystical about it. The blackening, the dissolving, the stripping away of a false structure before anything truer can take its place. It isn't metaphorical suffering. It's the actual, unglamorous grief of realizing you built years of your life around an incomplete picture of yourself, and that the picture is now unavailable to you. You can't unsee what the pattern has shown you. You can only decide what to do with having seen it. There's a specific difficulty here that deserves its own attention, because it's rarely discussed honestly. The people around a person going through this collapse usually aren't going through it themselves, and they didn't sign up for the version of you that's currently under construction. A marriage built around one partner's constant availability doesn't automatically survive that partner deciding availability was never actually love, just fear wearing a helpful costume. A friendship built around always being the one who listens doesn't automatically survive the listener deciding they're allowed to need something back. Family systems in particular tend to resist a member's individuation with more force than almost anything else in a life, because a family is a set of roles that depend on everyone continuing to play their assigned part. The moment one person stops performing theirs, the whole system has to renegotiate, and renegotiation is rarely welcomed by everyone at the table. This is part of why Jung considered individuation a genuinely dangerous undertaking, in the specific sense that it asks a person to risk relationships, identities, and certainties that had previously felt load-bearing. He wasn't being dramatic when he described the process in terms borrowed from alchemy and mythology. Descent, dismemberment, death, and rebirth. Those were the closest available languages for describing something that doesn't feel survivable while it's happening, even though it usually is. The people who make it through tend to describe the same thing afterward. It was worse than they expected, and it mattered more than they expected, and both of those things were true at the same time. What tends to surprise people who go through this honestly is what comes after the dissolving, because it isn't triumph exactly. It's something quieter and more durable. The man who finally acknowledges his anger doesn't become a different person overnight. He becomes someone capable of noticing the feeling before it has to borrow a stranger's face to get his attention. The woman who leaves the hollowing out career doesn't step into instant clarity. She steps into a life with more friction and more honesty than the one she left, which is a genuine trade, not an automatic upgrade. The reward for taking synchronicity seriously isn't a life with fewer difficult feelings. It's a life where the difficult feelings finally have a direct route to you, instead of having to detour through the external world to be heard at all. That's the actual power on the other side of integration. Not magic, not certainty, not a permanent state of enchanted alignment with the universe. Capacity. The capacity to notice your own unconscious material earlier, in dreams and moods and slips of the tongue, before it has to escalate into something loud enough to arrange itself in the external world. People who have done this work for years tend to report the same strange thing. The dramatic, unmistakable synchronicities happen less often, not more. Not because the connection has weakened, but because it no longer needs to shout. A life that's actually listening doesn't require the same volume. Consider what changes for the man from earlier, the one whose suppressed anger kept borrowing strangers' faces to reach him. A year into actually feeling his own anger instead of managing it into invisibility, the strangers stop losing their temper at him with the same frequency. It's tempting to read that as a coincidence resolving itself, but Jung's model offers a more specific explanation. The anger no longer needs an external stand-in, because it finally has a legitimate route home. He notices it now in his own chest, in the tightness of his jaw during a difficult conversation, in a dream where he says the thing he's never said out loud. The message reaches him through the cheapest, closest channel available, which is exactly how it was always supposed to work, before decades of avoidance forced it to take the long way around through other people's outbursts. The same shift shows up in less obviously dramatic ways too. A woman who spent years unable to admit she wanted to leave her marriage, and who kept dreaming of doors she couldn't open, and then finding actual locked doors everywhere she went that week, eventually names the wanting directly, in a journal first and then out loud to a therapist. The locked door dreams don't vanish overnight, but they thin out over the following months, replaced increasingly by dreams that are stranger and more specific. Dreams that seem to be working through the actual texture of the decision rather than just insisting she notice it exists. The unconscious, once it trusts that its material will actually be received, tends to get quieter and more precise, rather than louder and more insistent. It stops needing to break through a wall and starts being allowed simply to speak. Before going further, it's worth addressing the fears that tend to surface at exactly this point, because they're common enough to name directly rather than leave unspoken underneath the rest of the video. The first is the fear of losing your grip on reality. The worry that taking synchronicity seriously means abandoning the rational faculties that have kept you safe and functional for years. That fear deserves respect rather than dismissal, because there is a version of this territory that genuinely does become disordered thinking, where every event gets forced into significance whether it earns it or not, where pattern seeking curdles into something closer to paranoia. Jung himself was wary of this slide and wrote about it directly. The distinction he drew, and the one worth holding on to, is between a mind that stays rigorous about which coincidences actually carry unmistakable personal charge and which don't, versus a mind that has stopped being able to tell the difference. Taking synchronicity seriously was never meant to mean taking every coincidence seriously. It was meant to mean no longer automatically dismissing the ones that clearly do carry weight. The second common fear is that acknowledging this pattern in your own life will make you strange to the people around you, that you'll become someone who talks about signs and meaning in rooms full of people still operating entirely inside a causal worldview, and that you'll pay a social cost for it. That fear is realistic rather than irrational. Some relationships genuinely don't survive one person's individuation for the reasons already discussed. But the actual cost tends to be smaller and more specific than the fear predicts. Most people who integrate this material don't become evangelists for it. They simply become quieter and more honest about their own inner life, in ways that show up as increased steadiness rather than increased strangeness to the people who know them well. The friends worth keeping tend to notice the steadiness before they notice anything else. The third fear is subtler and rarely gets named at all. The fear that if you actually follow what the pattern is pointing toward, you'll discover something about yourself you can't undo the discovery of. That fear is entirely accurate, and it's worth sitting with rather than talking yourself out of. You genuinely cannot unknow what integration reveals. The man who finally feels his own anger cannot go back to believing he never had any. The woman who admits her career has been hollowing her out cannot fully return to the version of herself that didn't know that. None of this is a reason to avoid the process. It's simply an honest account of what the process costs, offered without the false comfort of pretending the cost isn't real. This is worth naming honestly, because it complicates the popular image of a spiritually awakened person surrounded by constant glowing signs. The truth Jung's work points toward is closer to the opposite. The person who has genuinely integrated the lesson of synchronicity tends to have a quieter relationship with it, not a louder one, because the whole point of the pattern was never the pattern itself. It was always the message trying to reach them by whatever route was still open. Once the direct routes are open again, once dreams are taken seriously, once feelings are named instead of managed, once the shadow has somewhere honest to go, the external world doesn't need to work as hard to get through. That reframes the entire question people usually ask about this topic. It isn't, how do I get more synchronicities? It's, what would have to become true about how I live for the message to reach me without needing the world to shout it? And that question, unlike most spiritual content on this subject, doesn't have an easy or flattering answer. It usually means facing whatever you've been most carefully avoiding. The anger, the grief, the decision, the relationship, the identity that no longer fits, long before you get to feel finished with the process. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with reaching this understanding, because most people around you will still be operating entirely inside the causal, coincidence-only framework, and you'll no longer be able to fully return to it, even if part of you wants to. You'll notice patterns you used to dismiss. You'll feel a pull toward honesty in moments where avoidance used to be easier. That isn't a curse, even though it can feel like one in the early months. It's the cost of having actually seen the thread instead of just hearing about it. This loneliness has a specific texture worth describing, because it rarely announces itself as dramatic isolation. It's smaller than that, and stranger. It's the particular silence that follows mentioning a meaningful coincidence to someone at dinner and watching their face rearrange itself into polite indulgence before the conversation moves on to something safer. It's the awareness, growing slowly, that most conversations happening around you are conducted entirely on the surface of things. Logistics, opinions, plans, while an entire layer of what actually matters in a person's life goes unmentioned, by mutual unspoken agreement, in nearly every room you enter. Once you've started paying attention to your own inner material, that silence becomes audible in a way it wasn't before, and there's no way to unhear it. Jung himself described a version of this isolation in his own life, particularly during the years surrounding his break from Freud and the psychiatric establishment that had once celebrated him. He lost colleagues who considered his later work an embarrassment to a field still fighting for scientific legitimacy. He was, for stretches of his career, genuinely alone in the specific sense of having no peer group that could fully understand what he was working through, because almost no one else was working through anything comparable at the time. What kept him going wasn't certainty that he was right. It was a conviction that the material itself, his patient's actual experience, his own actual experience, deserved to be taken seriously regardless of whether it cost him standing among people whose approval he might otherwise have wanted. That's worth remembering when the loneliness of this process starts to feel like evidence you've taken a wrong turn. It isn't evidence of that. It's closer to a natural consequence of having noticed something most of the people around you haven't yet had reason to notice. The isolation tends to soften over time, not because everyone eventually catches up, but because a person going through this usually finds their way, eventually, to a smaller number of people who are further along the same road, or willing to walk part of it alongside them. The wide, shallow connection of a life spent entirely on the surface gets traded for something narrower and considerably more real. If you're recognizing yourself in that description right now, the sense of having crossed a threshold you can't uncross, without yet having the tools to make sense of what's on the other side of it, that's precisely the gap true self-discovery was built to sit inside. 24 reflection exercises, drawn from Jung's own methods, aren't a replacement for the work of integration. Nothing is. But they're a way to actually do the work instead of just recognizing it needs doing, which is the exact place most people get stuck after a threshold like this one. It's linked below, for whenever you're ready to stop noticing the pattern and start following it somewhere. What's left, once the dissolving has happened and the noticing has become quieter, is the part of this that actually changes how a life gets lived. Not as a single revelation, but as an ongoing practice of paying attention to what your own life keeps trying to tell you. Jung never claimed synchronicity was something a person could manufacture or control. That's worth being direct about, because a great deal of content on this subject implies otherwise, that with the right mindset, the right vibration, the right daily practice, you can summon meaningful coincidence on command. That isn't what his case histories describe, and it isn't an honest promise to make to you. What he did believe, and what his decades of casework actually support, is that a person's relationship to the pattern can change even when the pattern itself can't be forced. The shift isn't from a life without synchronicity to a life saturated with it. It's from a life where the unconscious has to escalate into the external world to be heard at all, to a life where it has other, gentler channels available first. That's not a smaller shift than it sounds. It changes what you notice in a dream. It changes how long you sit with a mood before explaining it away. It changes whether you say the true sentence in the difficult conversation or the comfortable one. Every one of those small honesties reduces the pressure that used to need a scarab beetle, a stranger's overheard sentence, a name arriving twice in one day, to get through to you at all. This is what individuation actually looks like in practice, stripped of its more dramatic language. Rather than a finished state you arrive at and then get to keep, it's closer to a posture, an ongoing willingness to let the parts of yourself you'd rather not know keep having a say in how you live, rather than exiling them until they have to find louder ways back in. People who've done this work for years still get surprised by grief they thought they'd finished, anger they thought they'd resolved, decisions they thought were behind them. The difference isn't that the unconscious material stops arriving. It's that they've built a self capable of receiving it without needing the whole apparatus of coincidence to deliver the message. Jung's own image for this, late in his life, was less a straight road than a spiral staircase, a person circling back repeatedly to the same core questions, the same wounds, the same unresolved material, but at a different elevation each time, with a wider view available at every turn, even though the terrain underfoot looks familiar. That image matters because it corrects a common misunderstanding about what a psychologically integrated life is supposed to feel like. It isn't a life where the difficult questions get answered once and stay answered. It's a life where you keep meeting the same questions from a slightly higher vantage each time, with slightly more capacity to hold what they're actually asking of you. This is also why the people who take this work seriously tend to develop a specific kind of humility about their own progress, one that outsiders sometimes mistake for a lack of growth. Someone 20 years into this kind of ongoing self-examination will often describe themselves as still working on the exact same core issue they started with, still learning to trust their own perception, still learning to tolerate their own anger, still learning to let themselves need something from another person. That isn't failure to progress. It's an honest description of what a spiral actually looks like from the inside, where the elevation is nearly invisible to the person doing the climbing, and only becomes obvious when they look back down at where they started. There's a practical shape to this that's worth naming, because understanding the theory and actually living differently because of it are two separate accomplishments, and most people stop at the first one. The shift Jung was describing rarely announces itself as a single decision. It tends to show up in small, almost invisible choices, repeated often enough that they eventually add up to a different way of moving through a life. It looks like writing a dream down in the first minute after waking, before the day's noise erases it, even when the dream seems meaningless, even when it feels faintly embarrassing to take that seriously. Dreams that get recorded this way, over months rather than days, start to reveal their own pattern. The same location returning in different disguises, the same figure appearing at different ages, the same unresolved conversation replaying with slightly different words each time. None of that is visible from a single dream. It only becomes visible in the accumulation, which is why the people who benefit most from taking dreams seriously tend to be the ones who kept doing it long after it stopped feeling novel. It looks like noticing a strong reaction to another person, an irritation that feels slightly too large for the situation, an admiration that feels slightly too intense for someone you barely know, and asking, honestly, what part of that reaction actually belongs to you rather than to them. Jung's whole theory of projection rests on the idea that the qualities that provoke us most sharply in others are very often qualities we've refused to recognize in ourselves. That question is uncomfortable to ask sincerely because it rarely has a flattering answer. It's also one of the fastest routes back to material that would otherwise need a much louder, more disruptive channel to get through. It looks like treating a strong coincidence as a question rather than an answer. Not immediately deciding what it means, not rushing to interpret it as permission or prohibition, but sitting with it long enough to notice what it's actually touching. The number that keeps appearing, the name that keeps surfacing, the stranger's sentence that landed too precisely to be nothing. Each of these is better approached the way Jung approached a patient's dream, not with a fixed dictionary of symbols, but with genuine curiosity about what it means specifically to this person, in this moment, given everything else currently alive in their life. And it looks like tolerating the discomfort of not resolving these questions immediately. Jung was famously suspicious of quick interpretations, his own included. He believed premature certainty about a symbol's meaning was often another form of avoidance, a way of closing the question before it had done its actual work on the person asking it. The temptation, once you start noticing synchronicity in your own life, is to want a tidy explanation right away, something you can file and move past. The more honest posture is closer to staying in the question a while longer than feels comfortable, because the discomfort itself is frequently doing something the tidy answer would have short-circuited. There's something worth saying plainly here, because it's easy to let a script like this drift into implying that every strange coincidence in your life is a summons towards some hidden truth. That isn't what Jung claimed, and it isn't what this is claiming either. Some coincidences are just coincidences, the ordinary, meaningless static of a universe running on probability, nothing underneath it demanding your attention. The difference Jung was pointing at was never about frequency alone. It was about charge, the specific, unmistakable feeling of personal resonance that separates an ordinary coincidence from the kind that stops you in your tracks and won't let you look away. You already know the difference when it happens to you. Nobody has ever needed convincing that a true synchronicity was meaningful. The difficulty was never noticing it. It was believing yourself entitled to take it seriously. It's worth being specific about how to tell the difference in practice, because "you'll know it when you feel it" is true, but not especially useful on its own. A meaningful synchronicity tends to share a few recognizable qualities across almost every account of it, Jung's patients included. It arrives with a physical component, a genuine jolt, a held breath, a prickling at the back of the neck, something the body registers before the mind has finished processing what happened. It carries specificity that a generic coincidence doesn't. Not just any bird at any window, but the exact image from the exact dream you had the exact night before. And it tends to arrive at a moment already charged with unresolved feeling, rather than in the middle of an ordinary, settled afternoon. An ordinary coincidence can happen at any time and mean nothing in particular. A true synchronicity nearly always lands during a period when something in you was already straining toward the surface, which is part of why the timing itself is so often as significant as the content. None of this is meant to turn pattern recognition into a rigid checklist, because Jung himself resisted turning his own ideas into formulas his followers could apply mechanically. It's meant as a rough, honest guide for a mind that's genuinely trying to distinguish signal from noise, rather than a mind that's already decided everything is signal because meaning feels better than randomness. The distinction matters because the entire credibility of this framework rests on it. A theory that finds meaning in absolutely everything has, in practice, found meaning in nothing. Jung's contribution was never that everything is connected. It was that some things are, in a way ordinary causality can't explain, and that learning to recognize which ones are worth your attention is itself part of the psychological work. That permission, to take your own inner life as seriously as you take external evidence, is really what this entire subject has been circling from the opening line onward. Jung spent his career trying to build a framework rigorous enough that a purely rational mind couldn't dismiss it, and honest enough that it never asked anyone to abandon their intelligence to make room for meaning. Synchronicity was never meant to replace causality. It was meant to sit alongside it, naming a category of experience that causality alone was never built to explain, and that most people had been taught to distrust in themselves long before Jung gave it a name. If you go back to the beginning of everything we've covered, the scarab tapping against the glass at the exact moment a rigid, defended woman needed something to break through, you can see the whole shape of it now, differently than you could at the start. It was never really about the beetle. It was about a psyche that had run out of gentler ways to reach itself, using the only channel still open. That's the story underneath every meaningful coincidence you've ever had, whether it involved an insect, a name, a number, a stranger's sentence, or a song at the exact moment you needed to hear it. Not proof the universe is watching you, evidence that some part of you has been trying to reach the rest of you, by whatever door was left unlocked. It would be dishonest to end this without saying clearly what taking synchronicity seriously does not promise you. It doesn't promise a life free of confusion. Jung himself, deep into old age, still described periods of genuine uncertainty about his own inner material, still had dreams he couldn't immediately interpret, still encountered coincidences that unsettled him before they clarified anything. Integration isn't a destination where the questions stop. It's closer to a change in how a person is equipped to meet the questions that keep arriving anyway, for as long as they're alive to have them. It also doesn't promise that following the thread will lead somewhere comfortable. Some of Jung's patients, having taken their own synchronicities seriously and followed them honestly, ended relationships that had looked stable from the outside. Some left careers, faiths, cities, entire identities they'd spent decades constructing. Not because the pattern demanded any specific outcome. Jung was adamant that the psyche doesn't hand out instructions that specific, but because honesty, once it's been allowed back into a life, tends to keep asking for more of itself, in every direction, whether or not the direction is convenient. What it does offer, and what makes the whole difficult process worth naming honestly, rather than dressing up as effortless enlightenment, is a specific kind of relief that's easy to underestimate until you felt it. It's the relief of no longer needing the external world to work as hard to reach you. It's the relief of trusting your own reactions instead of constantly explaining them away. It's the relief of a life that finally has room for the parts of you that used to have to detour through strangers, symptoms, and coincidence just to get a hearing. That relief doesn't arrive all at once, and it doesn't arrive without cost. But people who have lived on both sides of this threshold consistently describe it as a fair trade, even on the days it doesn't feel like one. That thread has been running through your own life the whole time you've been watching this, whether or not you've been ready to pull it. It doesn't ask you to believe in anything beyond what you already privately suspect, that the strange, precise, uncanny moments in your life have never quite been meaningless, no matter how many times you've told yourself otherwise for the sake of feeling reasonable. What Jung offered wasn't permission to abandon reason. It was a way to stop asking reason to do a job it was never built for. Think back, one more time, to the man on the floor of his father's study, holding a letter dated to a day that meant nothing to anyone but him. He didn't need anyone to explain to him that it mattered. He needed permission, the kind this whole subject has been quietly offering the entire time, to let it matter without immediately explaining it away, without reaching for the easy dismissal that would have let him close the box and go back downstairs unchanged. That's the actual choice every meaningful coincidence eventually presents, not a choice about what it means. A choice about whether you're willing to stay in the room long enough to find out, The thread doesn't announce itself as a thread the first time you notice it. It usually looks like an isolated, strange little moment, a beetle at a window, a letter dated to a birthday, a stranger's sentence that lands too precisely to be nothing. It's only in looking back, after enough of these moments have accumulated, that the shape becomes visible. Not a series of unrelated oddities, but a single, continuous line running underneath an entire life, tugging gently and then less gently at whatever's been left unattended for too long. You've likely already felt that tug more than once. Most people have by the time they're old enough to have accumulated a life complicated enough to need attending to. You don't need another explanation of what a synchronicity is. You've had enough of them in your own life to already know. What you need is somewhere to actually take that knowing, instead of letting it pass by the way it usually has, noticed, marveled at, and quietly set back down. That's exactly what true self-discovery was built for. 24 reflection exercises, grounded in Jung's own methods, made for the specific work of following the thread you've already felt tug at you more than once, back to whatever it's been trying to show you about your own way within. It's linked below.